All right. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Pam Jenkins. I'm retired kind of from the University of New Orleans, but I do a lot of different things. And it is my great pleasure to be at this conference and to be with you at this session today. I'm the moderator. We have 4 speakers, and I'm going to just make a few opening remarks and tell you what we're doing today. This session is about managed retreat, which is the most extreme of the adaptive strategies, as you well know. I'm talking to an audience of people that know this well. But it really sounds clinical, managed retreat, doesn't it? It sounds clinical. But it's really about real people and real lives and moving. And that affects all of us, and that's what we're talking about today. The more I do this, the more I think this is a conversation. And so we have kind of rethought the way this workshop will go. At the center of my own work and my own research, please come on in, find a seat, there's plenty. I've spent a lot of my life as a scholar sitting in people's living rooms, hearing their lives, trying to put their lives in a broader context. And that's kind of what we're going to do today. At the beginning, each panelist who will introduce themselves, because we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, you know them, will talk, outlining the broad issues of managed retreat from their own lived experience and their own research. And then I'm very carefully, so trust me with this, going to open the room up for you, each of you, as many as I can get to give me your thought, one thought, about managed retreat, which will go up here. And we're going to do that for a little bit because we're going to take pretty good notes about what this means for us. And then we're going to come back and the panel is going to react to what you've said. And then they're going to answer the last question, which is, are they hopeful? And that will be our session. I will tell you what I told the panel when we were organizing this. I'm an old teacher. I taught for a very long time. If you go on too long, I will not be rude, but I will stop you to make sure that all voices get heard. So we'll begin now with Camille.
Thank you so much, Pam. And just a little bit of context, this is a topic and discussion that is incredibly near and dear to my heart. It is the reason I became a planner. I was a young graduate student in the School of the Coast and the Environment, and was able to work on a cross-institutional, multi-disciplinary initiative in the Grand Bayou community in Lower Plaquemines Parish outside of the levee protection system. And I was trained to, from a sociologist perspective in the environmental world, I really listen and understand the needs of the community, the challenges that they were facing, and what their vision for the future was. And I was trained under Pam, and so we've been in this world since 2003 together. And I know and I say that because I know how difficult this conversation is. But I actually think that in Louisiana, there's no better place for us to really start defining, understanding, and leading on managed retreat. Managed retreat is strategically moving communities and infrastructure, including homes and businesses, away from environmentally high-risk areas. And it's been referred to as this in the literature, but it's also been one of the most controversial ways humans have responded to climate-related hazards due to the difficulty of identifying when, where, and by whom, and the process by which such movement should take place. And so, just the best examples happening nationally with managed retreat are buyout programs. Those don't sound that great. Over 40,000 residential buyouts have occurred in the United States. These are mostly around coastal regions or due to floods. And there's other terms that are out there in the planning world and the adaptation world: adaptive strategic retreat, relocation, resettlement, managed realignment. But I think at the end of the day, like, what are we talking about? So there's a federal program for it, and it's occurring. So why are we talking about it? 1.4 trillion of real estate is located within 700 feet of the U.S. coast. This is an enormous amount of individuals that and infrastructure and businesses and homes, everything, communities that we've got to think about what the future looks like. And the reality is a lot of those places are going to have to relocate. 4 to 13 million Americans will be affected by sea level rise. Seems like a big gap, but that's in the Matt Hauer research that we pulled. And so if just 1/10 of the people and buildings retreated, it would cost about $140 billion, almost 30 times what the U.S. has spent on managed retreat. And so it's a difficult topic because it's not what we've done in the past. There are significant equity concerns, and there's strong psychological barriers, competing with the concepts of home, community, sense of place, identity and place. So it's also incredibly difficult to implement. We see that here in Louisiana. We've got limited authority, so there's strong and constitutionally protected private property rights. You've got a lot of strong financial disincentives. Those with the power to engage in managed retreat, residents, local governments, the real estate industry, they have financial incentives to prevent retreat. And then you've got dense economic activities and development on, at-risk coast. And so there's no owner. That's another major issue that we see. There's no entity and ownership of whose responsibility is this. So why managed retreat then? Well, I would, there's, on one hand, if individuals are free to retreat, why manage it? But I argue that the most effective and cost-effective way to minimize risk would be the strategic managed retreat of communities who choose to participate in that conversation, but they also need to be at the forefront of leading what that looks like. So more other components to think about. It also is going to occur without management, without a managed structure around it, but it's going to have more significant cost because we've got abandoned property, vacant lots for government to maintain, loss of property tax revenue, harder to pay for public services. We hear over and over in the communities, this is not a parish president, councilman, mayor, this is not what they want to look at. Because they've got to, how are they going to maintain the property, and they don't want to lose people, they don't want to lose taxes. And if we don't manage locally, it's eventually going to fall onto the federal government. And we have examples of processes that haven't gone well in the past. And so we need to be owning this and really defining what it looks like here in Louisiana with Louisiana people. And it's not the appropriate answer everywhere. I just want to emphasize the critical piece of this. It hadn't been figured out, and so do we need to just start saying we got to move all of these individuals and stop investing in certain areas? Absolutely not. But we need to begin planning for the way in which we engage communities on this conversation. And how we respond and move with them, and the critical levels of responsibility and governance systems that are going to need to be propped up for this. So the role of planners to me, this is the planning, the planning opportunity to make sure that we use the principles that we've learned as planners to have this conversation instead of allowing others who might be seen by as the entities that need to be hired to do this work, to deliver through, big, gigantic contracts and in roles where they don't have the principles of planning and listening and community-led, the champions that we need to build and support. This isn't a engineering development project. It would be a highly sensitive and emotional, traumatic experience for the people involved, and we have to bring the tools available to those individuals who are having this conversation to make it the best outcome for them. So just looking in Louisiana, from recent numbers, there have been over 10,000 residential buyouts across the state. There are some community examples, Pecan Acres, Silverleaf, which was with the Center for Planning Excellence in Gonzales, and Ile de Jean Charles. And all of these have, their different processes because they are funded by different federal entities, which mean different rules, different regulations, different timelines, conditions. And so there's not one place within the federal government where this has been thought out and it's where it has a holistic approach. So this is what I see across our communities: death by 1,000 cuts. There's just a existing and increasing need to have this conversation because of what our coastal neighbors are experiencing. So we've got climate change and sea level rise. We have increasing homeowner and flood insurance costs, which I'm of the understanding that most people just don't even have flood insurance on the coast anymore. There's a loss of public and private institutions. Schools are leaving, businesses are leaving. How can you maintain community when your critical places, your businesses, your schools, your post office, your one grocery store is all leaving? And then simultaneously, you see gigantic secondary homes coming in and taking the place of what was once a rich and vibrant community. And then we're seeing the impacts from population cost and dwindling tax base. And so I wanted to start off with this kind of overview. I know that this discussion brings up a lot of emotions in people, and we all need to make sure that we've got grace and are sensitive to the topic. But in the planning profession, we've got to figure this out. We've got to figure it out in Louisiana. So thank you all for being here. Okay.
Will this advance the slides?
Yeah, it's the green button. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, got it. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Robbie Havens. I'm the economist with the data center in New Orleans. And so I was asked to frame the conversation with some data. Climate migration seems to be implying new pressures on a scale not yet seen. However, it also calls to mind old problems about the relationship between residential location and uneven investment, about place-based inequality, whether that's exposure to environmental hazards or access to economic opportunity, and about whether policy should focus on investing in places or encouraging the mobility of people. So the question about bringing data to this problem is actually quite a difficult one. First, migration in response to coastal climate or environmental change is difficult to pin down as a concept that can be measured. People move for a whole host of reasons unrelated to environmental hazards, and similarly, people who are displaced by a disaster might or might not come back. Some of the big estimates that we've seen from the Matt Hauer study, for example, are actually based on measures of permanent inundation, but we know here in coastal Louisiana that we face a range of exposures, whether it's perceived risk or repetitive loss or wind damage that is not necessarily the same as permanent inundation. Second, frankly, our data on migration is not very rich, and this is all the more reason to heed the knowledge of those residents who are closest to the issues. But nonetheless, the how much question, the quantitative question, is a critical one for all of the reasons that Camille framed for us. So I thought that in light of those challenges, we're better to start with the 2020 census data. And I'll come back at the end if I have time to address some of what we're doing in terms of the lack of clear lessons that we have from the data. But as a place to start, so Louisiana's population rose by 2.7% between the 2010 and 2020 census, although that leveled off by the end of the decade. And most of the population loss was actually in rural Louisiana, especially in North Louisiana. So actually the center of population in the state is around New Roads, and that is at the southernmost point that it's been since the 1900s. So what this is telling us is that we aren't seeing necessarily the huge population shift that we might be expecting, at least not quite yet. If we zoom in on South Louisiana, we see that many coastal areas, in fact, did lose population. And I'm looking at the lower portions of Terrebonne and Lafourche, Plaquemines, Cameron, and places like that. But we also see that growth in New Orleans, that's a little bit of recovery from Katrina, but St. Tammany Parish, suburbs of Baton Rouge, mostly the peripheral parts of our metro areas. If we compare these coastal population trends with projections of flood risk, colors got a little mixed up there. These are property level estimates from First Street Foundation, but we can definitely see a correlation between population change and the places experiencing the most intense flood risk. However, many of the areas that are gaining in population inland may have less extreme exposure to storm surge and sea level rise, but are also in many cases vulnerable to flooding. Data on migration, though sparse, suggests that people leaving coastal parishes either tend to move to neighboring parishes or move to these growing areas further inland. However, the overwhelming flows of population in our region over intermittent distances remain within metro areas. So, for example, between Orleans, Jefferson, and St. Tammany Parish, between East Baton Rouge Parish and the suburbs. And this data brings us to a focus on the complexity of migration, and specifically teasing out data from climate or environmental migration. So people move for lots of reasons. Obviously, migration varies with demographic factors like age and family structure, but studies also repeatedly find that economic opportunities are also the largest decision point, including in the most vulnerable areas of coastal Louisiana, like any place in the United States. Place-based social networks, cultural attachment, economic opportunity structures, these all matter, but in different ways for different people. The biggest shift that we should expect is that climate will only be one of these factors, but not necessarily the dominant factor. And that brings me to 4 puzzles or open questions about climate migration that I'll return to a little bit of data to walk through. First of all, we might consider changing economic opportunities as a leading indicator of climate migration. So again, if we look post about 2015, Louisiana began to fail to keep pace with the United States on growth of employment and also in growth in population. But the employment shift was not even across the state. If we look at job gains and job losses, the thing that sticks out to me on this map is if we look at our job centers in coastal areas of the state, which we know that these are important economic engines for our state's economy. But after 2015, a lot of these areas began to lose jobs. And some of that's related to what was going on in the oil and gas industry. But it could be the case that businesses retreat before people. And the decades and decades of research on deindustrialization in the United States has shown that in our economy, capital is more footloose than labor. And that's an important context for migration. Second, nationally and over the long term, one of the biggest stories about migration is that rates of mobility have been declining. And this is also true if we look in Louisiana. There may be some point at which climate overwhelms this trend, but if we've reached that point, it hasn't yet shown up in the data. But this also calls to mind one of the challenges with this how much question about climate migration. One of the fundamental problems is that trends might be nonlinear, or we could talk about tipping points. The lesson is that past trends might distort our predictions about the future, but at present, low rates of migration are important context for the question of managed retreat. Third, one of the barriers to moving is that over the long term, housing supply in the United States has not kept up with population growth, especially for multifamily housing. And this contributes to the high cost of housing for both owners and renters. It reduces the ability of people to migrate over long distances. And because home values are the largest source of wealth, it contributes to wealth inequality in our society. But the flip side of this is that in many cases, housing in Louisiana, like in other places, tends to get built in places where it's cheap to build housing, and that's often places with fewer services, with poorer infrastructure, et cetera. It also raises the question, if we do see intensified migration, where will the people go if the supply of housing continues to be so inelastic? And finally, I'll close with the role of policy and regulation, which I think is central to this question of managed retreat. We could talk about mitigation or non-structural adaptation, but something that is top of mind these days is insurance. And it's in the news all the time what's going on with homeowners insurance in states like Louisiana and Florida. But with the National Flood Insurance Program has been through a major reform over the past year. And as of August 2022, in the state of Louisiana, there were 20,000 fewer policies than there were 12 months earlier. That's a decline of about 4%, and it's not entirely clear what's going on there, but there's a lot of uncertainty related to insurance like there are with all these questions. So in closing, there's no shortage of questions about climate migration. How much, who wins, who loses, et cetera. Most importantly, what is to be done about it? And I'll just do a plug for research that we're working on right now in partnership with LSU. I think I saw my colleague, Dr. Douthat, in the room earlier. But we're essentially working on non-conventional data sources to better approximate the geography and temporal scale of exposure to flood risk and disasters in Louisiana. And in the discussion, I'm happy to share more about that project if it comes up. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am Sherelle Parfait-Dordor. I am Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw from Grand Cayudulac, and I currently serve as Elder Chief for my people. I've lived down the bayous my entire life, and a lot of the work that we've been involved in, of course, deal with everyday life, right? Dealing with trying to protect and preserve our culture, protect and preserve our identity, especially our homelands. A lot of people don't know, but in our language, my uncle gave me the name Traiteur d'État, and that means healer of the land. A lot of my work these days involves trying to protect and preserve the land that we call home. And that's becoming much more difficult to do. Specifically due to extractive practices that have occurred over many generations with no responsibility or accountability for what was done. We no longer have the sediment that used to feed our homelands and build new lands, right? Because all of those things were levied off. So our land is no longer growing, it's steadily eroding away. And along with that, so do our estuaries, right? Which many people can tell you today that the subsistence lifestyle is on the decline. We no longer have the supply of shrimp or crabs or things of that nature that we used to at one time, that not only helped to provide food for the community and others, but also provided an income for the people to be able to live their lives, right? Be able to provide for their homes and the children. We've had to see the conditions in the community deteriorate over time. And with each passing event, with no new investments coming into the community to mitigate the challenges that we're facing due to storms or due to land loss and sinkage and sea level rise, a lot of people have had to make the tough decision on whether or not they can stay there safely. And I know we're going to have to do a new study, especially since Hurricane Ida, because many people lost their homes in the coastal communities since Hurricane Ida. I know we did. We lost everything. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for us, our neighbors that we had for 15 years couldn't do it anymore. They were elderly and they were retired, and they couldn't do it anymore. So they had to move further inland, and they moved to another state, which is just heartbreaking, because these were wonderful people, great neighbors, family to us. But I don't know what we would have done had they not sold us their damaged home, right? Because everything else was either outside of our affordability, and there was a lack, right? There's a housing crisis right now. So when you have a community that no longer is able to sustain itself the way that it once did, right, through subsistence, and generate a good income to be able to provide for themselves, because of all of these outside forces that are impacting these communities, it makes it very, very challenging when you're trying to recover from disasters. You have to take the best option that's available to you, right? And even though you might understand that you're now residing in an area that is prone to disaster, and you know that you can't safely stay there, you may not have an option, right? Because it's just not affordable to you. A lot of our communities are now aging communities, which means we have a lot of elders that are in our communities now rather than younger people, brand new young families that are trying to have children. And that's also going to increase, the decline, because the schools are being shut down now. Just last night, we found out that we were successful. The community was successful in having the elementary school repaired, right? And they fought really hard. That was amazing work on their part. But they were really quick to mention that, okay, these are the statistics, and it's steadily declining in population. So by a few years down the line, I anticipate that that's going to be back on the table again, right? For them shutting down the schools because of the decline. So we have to think of other options for people that choose to stay, because quite frankly, no one wants to leave their homeland, right? And particularly for indigenous peoples. Those are our homelands that's connected to everything that we are. It's our life way. It's our identity. And when you are removed from that, and you're not able to move into another indigenous community that's similar to your culture and your identity and your practices, you now assimilate into that new community. It's just something that happens, right? And it's not to say that that's a negative or a positive thing. It just is. Okay, each community is unique. Each community is diverse. And we have been working with other communities that are facing a lot of these challenges, because we understand what they're about to have to deal with. And it's going to take all of us working together to be able to figure out how to resolve these different challenges that we're facing. And also to be able to protect and preserve our culture and our identity and our language and all of these beautiful things that make a community, right? These things are going to keep happening. So as leaders in our communities and the communities themselves, it's important that they're at the forefront of the decision making, that they're at the forefront of what's being proposed. Because at the end of the day, it's this community that's going to be affected by what's happening. And people should have a choice on whether or not they choose to remain in place and be able to invest and adapt and mitigate resiliently, or whether or not they choose to resettle in another location. But in order to protect and preserve their identity, that needs to happen united, right? The community as a whole needs to be able to relocate into another area together. Otherwise, you lose everything that made that community in the first place. So I'm really honored for the opportunity to be here with you today and share some of these experiences and some of the things that we've been able to learn over the years in this work.
I'm live. Let's see. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe it's just that it's not loud, but it's fine. I could be loud when I want to. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Shelton. I'm so excited to be here. I am the president of the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, and we are a civic engagement organization that works around the state to ensure that communities of color and other marginalized communities actually have their voices play out within our electoral system, and that people understand that there is a direct connection between elected officials as well as then the policies that then impact their lives. And I think that more than ever, we've learned since COVID that there's a clear and direct connection about elected leaders determining whether you're safe at your job, whether your kids are safe at school. They're determining everything. And I think that there has been a disconnect over time that no longer can be ignored by any of us about the power of our elected leaders and then how and what decisions they make then impact our lives. I have done a lot of disaster recovery work. I started my work in disaster recovery with Hurricane Katrina and then went on to do Rita, Gustav, Ike, and then the BP oil spill happened on my birthday, and then it was like, maybe I need to not live in a disaster paradigm anymore. And figure out also too, like I think the biggest thing that I learned from that experience and why the Power Coalition existed was that, so how is it that I had, all of this money from the Bush-Clinton Katrina Fund, so $50 million. I had access to 2 former presidents. Our chair of our board at the time was the former ambassador to South Africa during the breakup of apartheid. So he worked with Nelson Mandela to literally put the country back together on the other side of apartheid. And we couldn't fix anything at scale, right? Like, so the 50 million I had was far dwarfed by the 50 billion the federal government was deploying into our communities, but none of us saw it or felt it. And, and I talk a lot about how, we spent so much of our time building policy infrastructure to force as much of that money to the ground as possible. And, I am both glad and also saddened to say that of that 50 billion that Louisiana received after Katrina, about 100 million of it, we were able to actually get on the ground in ways that I could touch, see, and feel in communities. And then I don't know what happened to the rest, right? And I think that our communities also feel that gap. And, there's a lot of talk about disaster capitalism, or there's not enough talk about disaster capitalism, but I'll get back to that in a second. In my work to do disaster recovery, the thing that I understood was that money and access to people with power was not enough, that actually we needed people power, that we had a pretty car with no engine. It was gorgeous, it was shiny, no wheels, all the things, but that we couldn't actually move the car because people were hurting and disengaged and disenfranchised because they were trying to put their lives back together, and it didn't seem like government was trying to help. And so in my work, with the Disaster Recovery Foundation at the time, now Foundation for Louisiana, we did a lot of work building infrastructure so that in the midst of any storm, that community could respond. And I'm proud to say that on the other side of all of these storms, that community and mutual aid is one of the most powerful tools that we have. And I'm proud to say now that when a storm hits, I can push out, $200,000, $300,000 within a day and have people actually have money in hand to figure out how, when a storm hits, which is always either the middle or the end of the month on payday, how you're supposed to use the money to pay your bills, but also pay for a hotel, gas, and food on the road while you're waiting to be able to see what's in the aftermath of that storm and what it did to your home. And so, there are improvements and there's still so much work to be done. And so one of the things that's also important, I think, both Camille and Robert hit on this, is that, land is a very powerful tool in Louisiana and the Deep South in general. Land, in a poor state like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, which are the Deep South states, land is everything. I mean, it's sometimes the only asset that families have. It's the only thing that they have to leverage, to mortgage, to use to be able to change their circumstance and their families. And we also saw that after Katrina, that we couldn't get clear title on many properties so that folks could even gain access to that property. And then one of the other things that were also a contributing factor to this piece too is like the federal-led recovery is problematic, and it's different every single storm. There's no continuity, there's no things that make sense. Sometimes, some storms, there are programs that are built and they work from a place of dignity. There are other storms where I have had to work unbelievably hard to try to create a pathway for people to figure out how to get all the things that they needed. And so it's like, how do you begin the process of really building, a recovery process that allows people to not have to migrate? And if we are going to talk about, managed retreat, well, how do we do that in a way that's truly equitable and giving people the actual value of their land if they were to go somewhere else, right? And you can even see it in real time. So think about New Orleans. In Treme, you cannot buy a house for under $400,000 today. I mean, I looked, I couldn't find any. You can get some rehabs, a few lots, but even the lots are unbelievably expensive. So what that means is that, so for the oldest Black neighborhood in the country, Treme, that you have people that have lived there for generations that have left that property, and then left that property when the valuations were done after Katrina, where they were undervalued. It's been very well documented how these property assessments have gone in New Orleans and certainly in our rural lower lying communities on the coast. That there's just a disparity, right? If you live in the right zip code, you're going to be fully restored, and if you don't live in the right zip code, your home is going to be seriously undervalued. And so folks have left undervalued property to now come back to see that those same communities are now, again, you can't find a house for less than $400,000 in Treme, and it blows my mind. And I think that, we just had a constitutional amendment on the ballot last month where New Orleans was trying to address the property disparity that, for those that did not leave, their income has not changed. It's nice that new people are moving in and coming into those communities, or maybe they don't think it's nice. But from a Blight perspective, there's a house that's been restored, but at the end of the day, what they're doing is essentially making it untenable for people to be able to stay in their communities that have been in their families for generations because they can't afford the property taxes. And then the constitutional amendment failed. It was really close. We almost got it. I mean, there's this whole kind of New Orleans versus the rest of Louisiana thing, which I think ultimately, unfortunately, kind of pushed them out of the way of being able to have that victory. But I think it's a tale for all of us, for all of our communities. Like Charles is experiencing it right now, this large buy-up of properties, folks being unable to restore their communities. This past storm, Ida, was the first storm where I saw so many folks make the choice to live on their property in tents and not leave. They chose not to leave. They chose not to go to another facility. They chose not to worry about a FEMA trailer. They were living on their property until they can fix it piece by piece by piece. And I think that is unbelievable from what we saw after Katrina to what we now see in Ida. And there are, I've got 2 minutes, so I'm gonna go really quickly because to tell you some solutions, okay? I think there are lots of solutions, and we just saw it recently. Last year, the feds fixed the Stafford Act so that people could actually declare ownership of their property without a clear title. That single decision would have saved the Ninth Ward. It would have singularly been able to allow the Ninth Ward to recover from Hurricane Katrina. And so we know that these opportunities to address the Stafford Act and its issues and its rigidity are really critical to fixing disaster recovery and the way in which they recover. The other thing that I've been working with a group of national folks across the country, with organizing resilience, and we've been really pushing around we have to fix this, and we have to create a strategy that is the same, right? Like that every response has the same thing. And so we've been talking about a disaster tax credit. Why are we spending, every time I hear an announcement, we just heard one 3 months ago about more money coming to Lake Charles. The work we do in Lake Charles and the people I'm working with Lake Charles are still not seeing those resources. And so when I hear 145 million, 167 million, I'm always trying to figure out, well, who has it and where is it and why can't we move those resources to the ground? But if you actually think about, a disaster tax credit where anyone that's in a federally declared storm would automatically get $1,500 a month for 3 months, it's like, you either choose the overhead and the bureaucracy of FEMA or you choose people. And I think we saw with the PPP loans that it can be done efficiently, that when it came to businesses, we fixed it. We figured it out. We moved money. We helped people. We can do the same thing if we trust people to actually rebuild their homes. And again, it's their home. So they're going to do the right thing. And if they choose not to do the right thing, then that's on them and their family. But I do think that doesn't mean that the rest of us should be dealing with this really broken system that is not worked. Managed retreat is important, and we've got to make sure that we do it in an equitable and fair way where we're getting fair market value to people for those properties, much like we see, back during Katrina, those folks were being offered pennies on the dollar, and now those homes are worth $400,000. And then the last thing I would say is that because disaster is not limited to or climate is not just limited to this piece. I always talk about resilience, and people love to talk about how people in Louisiana are resilient, and we're beautifully resilient people. But what I remind people all the time is that resilience is a short-term experience. I'm supposed to stretch myself until you can fix something. And if you never fix it, it's just oppression. We don't have to keep pretending because we didn't die, that somehow we're amazing. I was like, no, I want you to fix it. And you have the money to fix it. I read the paper. I read the press releases. I see the money flowing through our state, but I don't ever get it. How do we get it more to the ground? And so there's a lot of policy work that can be done. And then also too, thinking about what are those other industries for our coastal communities, because we do know that at the end of the day, a lot of our Native communities were completely not even included in the Katrina conversation and were drawn out of the maps. And so when we talk to FEMA now about, they have a new equity task force, and they're like, can you believe it? And I was like, yeah, I can believe it, and it's not the only terrible thing that happened. There's a whole list of terrible things that happened. And so I say all of that to say that, we have an opportunity to think about how we do disaster recovery differently. What we're currently saying too is that we've been blessed that we even get federally declared disasters. Do you know that in places like Minneapolis, if there's an Arctic storm or the polar vortex, if it's not named, you get no federal support. And so even as we're getting federal support, how are we actually moving those dollars? How are we actually prioritizing people and communities? And how are we also thinking about the future and jobs and generation around, climate change is here. How are we looking at wind and solar? How are we helping that to be the new economic driver in our coastal communities who are losing land, who are losing their way of life, and thinking about the future is here and we must embrace it. So I will stop there.
Thank you.
They were fabulous, huh? And now it's your turn, I have to tell you. So what we wanted you to do is to listen to these voices, 4 very different voices about the same issue, and then for you to think about what occurs to you. Not so much a question as what occurs to you. So I'll start with one of my best students who now left us, Tara. So you have to give us your best your question, not question, but your statement about managed retreat. Can you do that for me?
Yeah, I think so. I work for St. John Parish, and we were. I tried to be loud, but I can't do it. I work for St. John Parish, and we were identified as a receiving community in the LA Safe Adaptation Strategy. And I spent a lot of time thinking about preparing infrastructure for populations that might come in. But then it's also, how do you prepare culturally for cultures to come in and feel at home?
How do you prepare culture? So, thank you, Tara, and I'm passing it back to Charles. I had these picked out.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Pam. Just another, I mean, I guess this is just kind of raising another complexity that sometimes comes up. I'm wondering if we think about managed retreat too much as another project, like adaptation type project, and maybe this is something we should think about more in a 10 or 20 year time scale. Does that make it any easier, or does that just add a different level of complexity? And does it also help get to kind of the generational question that is the conversation respectful of that the very youngest in a community might have different goals or visions for the future than the oldest, or how does that work together? Does that fix? Sorry, two. That's two.
No, that's two. That's okay. So one is maybe it's a long-term project. Maybe we need to think about it for that. And then secondly, what is the generational part of how do the generations different? And I think we could ask Jonathan Foray that if he were here about how he's come to think about. I think those are two really good points. Janet, over here, and then I'm going to open it up.
So one of the things I was thinking about is just the emotional side of losing yourself, losing your land, losing your jobs, and how that works into this and how you deal with that side, the mental health, emotional health aspects of.
The literature has begun to call that about the trauma. They've really named it, and there's not a lot of work being done, but some being done about the trauma of cascading storms. And so I think that's a really good point, Janet. So put that up. And that comes exactly to your point. How many times do you have to be resilient in your life? How many times do you pack up your belongings? How many times do you leave it and then you leave it for good? All right. Those were all my plants. So I want to, yes, sir.
I'm curious about the comment about the school closing. I know that I'm a member of the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, and we've been having conversations about where schools are opening, and some schools are opening in central Louisiana because of this migration that's taking place, and that is those families that were talked about before that are leaving the southern part of the state, they're going somewhere. So just like businesses, even schools and school systems are having to adjust from an education standpoint. And I on one hand, happy for those communities, but to Camille's point about a death by 1,000 cuts, that's an example of that school probably will close over time that you described, and that community will slowly struggle as a result of it. But how do you plan for that sort of thing, because it's probably going to happen?
This idea of when a school closes, this battle to keep the school open was really important for that community. But they were clear it's just a short-term solution.
Because how many schools did you already lose since Ida?
Onishan, the community of Onishan lost their elementary school. And that was before Hurricane Ida. And again, they mentioned the decline in the population, right? Which we do understand that, it's a numbers thing, right? Although we don't understand, because, these are bayou communities, and when you have communities, they have their own school, those children have the opportunity to grow up in their environment, right, in their community environment. So when you close those schools down, and now you have to either merger them, with another school further inland, they're going into a whole other culture, right? So death by 1,000 cuts. Once the school closes, it's usually not far behind that, the community really starts to hit a heavy decline. And like I said, we were really thankful. I mean, the community did an excellent job showing up to stand up for the elementary school. They are going to repair the elementary school, but right under that, they still spoke about the anticipated decline. So that just means that it's a temporary situation.
I love this conversation about schools, and I'll just say that as everyone was talking, I was thinking about not only your community present day, but kind of going backwards, back to Katrina. And if you think of schools as that indicator species and the health of the environment and the ability to recover, because when a disaster hits and the school is damaged, those communities don't come back until the school is there. And so in my perspective, I really feel like the school becomes this key indicator in the health of a community, in your case, present day, and then looking back, and then the ability to recover. So I really love this topic.
I think schools are a really important piece of what recovery is and the stress around recovery, but also you have to talk, especially in lower parishes, about healthcare availability and grocery store availability and all of those kinds of things. So let me go to this table. Does somebody have a statement? Yes. Okay. Here you go. Pass it around.
I'd like to add to this conversation the issue of helping people who do choose to leave to move together so that they can maintain their not only family connections, but the other community connections, because that's going to be that much more successful of a move for a community.
So that's exactly what you were talking about. Yeah. Go ahead.
I wanted to just for a second talk about the Islanos Museum in Delacroix. I'm married to a Hernandez who's Islanos, and just talking about a culture assimilating to something that's not their own. But it was a beautiful museum where you could see actual pictures of some of the original people that landed here, and it just makes you think of how to document each one of these movements into public art, fine arts, something that really celebrates what they were and what they're becoming. So.
That's really a great point. And please go ahead.
Yeah, so my thought is just how important it is to plan for managed retreat, but also how difficult. So I work at the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, which we are the marine laboratory for the state of Louisiana, and we're down at the very southern end, or at least the southern landward end of Terrebonne Parish. And so I've been watching both personally and professionally what's been happening in the state over the last, 15 or so years in terms of our planning for climate change and sea level rise. And we've done, across the state, there's actually been a lot of very, very good work between CPRA, between NGOs, between the academic community. There's actually been a lot of very good work. It hasn't been perfect in every situation, but there's a lot of people that have tried very hard and done very, very good work. And then, Hurricane Ida came along, and the damage from that was all wind, or at least in central Terrebonne Parish, the damage from that was wind. We actually had a water level drop, but we had 100+ mile-an-hour winds. And so particularly in the, Chauvin, which is the community that I drive through, a lot of the damage there was wind. And so it's like we've been spending the last, decade, it's like in a football team, we've been planning for a running game, and we got hit with a passing attack.
Yes.
And so, so how just challenging that is to do that, but how important it is as well from a demographic and from a societal perspective. And I just think, hey, in the U.S., there's a lot of ways that power and money is handed out, but a lot of times it is handed out just by sheer population numbers. So, representation in Congress is based on population. The Census Department, not the census, but the U.S. government hands out billions and billions of dollars every year based on census counts. And so having people in an area there's a lot of reasons why you want to have people in an area. And one of those is just the basic distribution of power and money in the country.
I think that that's a really important part. Ida seems to me to have been a whole different kind of storm, of a whole different reaction. And what you were saying about people not leaving their home and staying in tents and not, we're just at a whole different place. I'm right over here. I got it. Sorry.
I had a question about legislation. As you see more all of this internal migration and the resistance to receiving people, not just from the community, you see municipalities coming up with laws. I think at one point, St. Tammany had a building moratorium on anything over a certain size of land. Has there been any discussion about going and not just having legislation that facilitates this move, but at least having some legislation that prevents municipalities from making it more difficult for communities to move and to migrate?
It's complicated. As with many things in Louisiana. So, I mean, so there, you know, like one good thing that has happened is that, I mean, you know, St. Bernard is kind of a great example of like a community that tried to legislate that people couldn't move there, and the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center sued them to the point of they were personally being charged by thousands of dollars by the day. And it's like, how much of your own money are you willing to spend to be racist, right? And so, like, you know, like, so there are some federal laws that do help and prevent some of those things. And so even, and I think too in Louisiana, we see this across the board on a lot of policies. Local municipalities will pass, and the state will pass policies that are incongruent with federal law. Federal law, it trumps all of it. And so, you know, people, you know, I'll never forget when the, you know, all of the gun legislation was being talked about nationally, and everybody was like, oh no, we're gonna pass a law in Louisiana. It's like, you can pass it, it doesn't mean anything, because federal law stands and always will trump local, you know, local policy. So some of it's just about education and enforcement, and then bringing in the right federal agencies to make people do the right things, and then using partners like Fair Housing Action Center and others to be able to enforce the realities that people should be able to move. And I do think that there is a lot of resources within the Office of Community Development and the Louisiana Housing Corporation that we need to continue to tap to be able to make sure that we are facilitating that. I think it's a great idea to be explicit about the fact that we are creating opportunities for people to be able to do that easily. But yeah, policy is a huge part of this at every level of government.
Great, and thank you. Here you go.
So I just have a comment that I think this conversation, you know, I'm a visual thinker, and so when I was looking at the census map of 2010 to 2020 and the areas of the state, especially in South Louisiana, that are growing most rapidly, seem to be these largely suburban areas that are product of sprawl and might be in, you know, let's say unwise places to build whole communities today, and might be the next victims of significant you know, climate change, land loss, et cetera. Those right now feel like they are kind of our receiving communities because that's where homes are being built, et cetera. And I know that in the other room at the same conference, they're talking about, you know, inner city development, transportation development, and equity in those things. And my comment is that I think there's such an opportunity for overlap between this conversation and that one. And I know probably that's the point of this conference, but but I think there's something to be said for the municipalities having a real conversation about being receiving communities, what it takes to get there, and how building density can actually accommodate relocation in a way that may be able to keep families and communities together, and in a way that places them nearest transit and nearest, you know, schools, nearest one another.
That is such a great comment. I just have to say, if we could manage to coordinate where people go and what they go to and bring, you know, that would work. We've got hands here.
I planted him.
So
yeah,
we're going to let a couple more go, and then you guys will comment and we'll roll up. Okay.
Great. Yeah, mine is sort of building off of that. I got to work with Pam and chart a little bit on some of the receiving communities and climate migration research. And listening to all of this today is just making me think about repeat disasters. And so I'm kind of comment question, but national or international research experience with communities who go through the whole process of retreat or migration, get hit by something else, right? I mean, I think that's part of the climate conversation. There is no safe place to go. And so that always feels like the complicated layers. And speaking of trauma and the psychological aspects of this, of how do you even navigate like building that promise to communities to move somewhere quote unquote safer when actually we have no idea what's coming next.
Yeah, and that uncertainty. One more. And then I'll ask you all to have your closing comments, including, are you hopeful?
So I have a comment related to small businesses and thinking about how they can be part of a managed retreat and how they can start adapting now their businesses toward potentially moving or changing their type of business and not just disbanding, but that they could be taken into consideration in terms of the retreat.
That's a great point as well. And now we'd ask you to think about the complexity of managed retreat, and we barely touched the surface. And we have such experts in this room and on this panel, and we barely got to it. And to think how much more conversation we need to have about what's going to happen to us tomorrow. This isn't in the future. So I'll reverse the order. So you've got 3 or 4 sentences to kind of say what you really want to say, and then are you hopeful?
Sure. You know, one thing I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up was, you know, we actually, ERAD actually did do a managed relocation. Southern Mutual Health Association as a local nonprofit, or well, regional, you know, a rural community nonprofit, and they specifically focus on rural. And so it's been done, and it was done in a way that community did it on their own, right? Like they did it. They didn't do it on their own, but they did it from the way they wanted to do it, right? Like not this idea of like other people coming in and telling them what it needed to look like or how it was going to be. And we keep reminding folks that like that's how it's supposed to be. And that nothing we're talking about when we talk about managed retreat is other people deciding for you anything as much as it is that opportunity to work together to solve a community problem, right? And I think that we need to make sure that is absolutely what's happening. Yes, I'm hopeful. Again, I'm working with folks across the country to try to address issues in the Stafford Act. There's so much rigidity in the federal money that comes down. And it's just like, again, if your school was destroyed by the storm, the money to fix your school still has to be allocated to fixing your school, right? And so but there's some stuff with Stafford Act that makes it harder. And so I'm hopeful because I do feel like there's some real conversations that are starting to happen because they're to the point that Robert made there, we're all losing until we have this conversation because there's almost nowhere in this country where you're not being exposed to disaster, whether it's fire, water, wind, tornado, hurricane, you name it. Like we're all vulnerable and we have to solve this problem together. And so I am hopeful because I think that there are some folks that are kind of sick and tired of being sick and tired and are trying to address it at the multiple levels to be able to try to get to some answers so that people are centered in the solution and not disaster capitalism or all of the other things that happen that exclude folks from being a part of their own future and being in control of their own future.
Of course, coming from an Indigenous perspective and identifying as tribal, it can be particularly difficult for Indigenous communities that identify as tribal, right? Especially when you're trying to access resources to assist your community in those types of decisions. Oftentimes we have these barriers automatically placed up in the front of us and they're like, oh, you're not federal, right? And there are these processes that tribal peoples are made to go through, okay? And personally, it makes me cringe to think that people are scrutinized so much. And yet at the end of the day, we're tax-paying citizens. I'm a small business owner myself. My husband and I pay lots of taxpayer dollars, but what our predominantly Indigenous communities don't see is a return of those taxpayer dollars being invested back into these Indigenous communities. And I always laugh and I'm like, okay, well, my tax dollars that I pay to you are Indigenous, they're Native, so it doesn't stop you from taking them, but we don't see it coming back, right? And it's those types of challenges that have just been steadily increasing over time. And it seems like every time that we have a success, they find another way to move the goalpost, right? And in the meantime, your communities are struggling for some of the most basic of needs. You know, and that's just exacerbated with climate crisis these days. Of course, I'm hopeful. Despite all of the challenges that we have had to experience generation after generation, what I'm seeing is people are starting to realize that we're not here on this planet by ourselves, right? And we have always kept faith in our youth, right? Because they have these wonderful, innovative minds, and they're not locked down into their ways of thinking. Like, you know, we tend to get locked down as we age. But I am hopeful. Every single day we see more and more people realizing reality and saying, okay, what can we do to join together to create a better future that's actually equitable and just for our future generations, right? We're a diverse planet, we're a diverse people, and we have very diverse challenges. And it's going to be in our diversity that we can come up with the solutions to these challenges. And despite the challenges, every single day, we get to see more and more people that are doing the right thing and trying to do their part in making sure that our future generations actually have a future and a better one. And that's what we're all here doing today.
Okay, well, I guess the only thing I want to say is I know that these are very difficult problems, but if we can alleviate the constraints on the supply of housing in a smart way and make the economy work a little bit better for everyone, then a lot of these very difficult problems become more tractable than they are now. So as far as am I hopeful, I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of in the business of like trying to chip away at really complicated problems with empirical evidence. So I try not to get into that mindset too much. However, if I can take anything hopeful away from it, it's, you know, we're just having a conversation about a more just society in terms of housing, jobs, environment, all at the same time. I think we understand that these things are more integrated now than we did even just a few years ago. So maybe there's some hope there. Also, and I know I talked about uncertainty a lot, and there's a lot of stress and difficulty involved with uncertainty, but also nothing gets better than the way it is now without, you know, embracing uncertainty in terms of what can change too. So that's what I.
Every time there's a disaster, CPEX puts together a long, here's what you need to do, governor and federal agencies. And we had some big wins with the IDA and, you know, just some policies and federal alignment that happened between FEMA and OCD. Which then allows our states to better align in their actions, because a lot of the misalignment is due to how resources flow and what those policies are. And so there's someone here, and Miss Barrett, are you in here? Hi, yes. So it gives me hope too, because this beautiful woman walks up to me, and I'm like, I know her, and she's in Louisiana, and she and I met in Hawaii, and we were at a relocation workshop, part of the Biden administration's last effort to, you know, hand over what managed retreat looks like at the federal level to the next administration, which didn't go anywhere. But we see a lot of new effort at the federal level, really wanting to talk about and cross-agency collaboration, a whole of government approach, digging deep on managed retreat, climate migration. And so I think it's, you know, the more that our agencies and policies and programs and resources align, the better that's going to be for us to see that those resources on the ground. And I feel like there's more people listening and wanting to make those changes. And so that's been really hopeful. And then I'll just end that Elder Chief Sherrill it's been really great to work with her. We started working together on the Climate Initiatives Task Force, and now we're partnering to help her tribe develop a resilience strategy. And one of the goals in that is to also understand how they can better communicate their wants and desires to the state, to the feds, because when there is a disaster, community wants a say in how that money flows and what it goes to. That might not always be part of the state's plan, and so we've got to figure out that relationship. And I think this is going to be a wonderful partnership to really dig deep and have those conversations. And we have our Chief Resilience Officer, the state's first Chief Resilience Officer, and it's Greg Grandy. God, I'm sorry. God, that's a tongue twister. Are here, and this is a critical topic to CPRA and the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. So I'm hopeful because of that too.
And thank you, and thanks to the panel. Can we give them a big hand? And I want to take this moment to do two things. One, to thank the sponsors for this panel and the session because it was really helpful, and also to thank the audience for coming with us as far as you did and participating, and I appreciate it. So thanks again.